Welcome to our online audience. We'll be starting shortly. Good afternoon. My name is Sue Burgess and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Shrine of Remembrance. And a really warm welcome to everyone here today, including our online audience. For those of you here in the auditorium, I'd ask that you turn your phones onto silent and in the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the directions of our Shrine staff. Should you require the bathrooms today, for those of us here in the auditorium, they're just on the other side of the door here to the left. Please be also aware for the people in the audience that we are recording and live streaming to YouTube today, but all of the cameras are pointed to the stage, so there should be nothing for you to worry about. The Shrine is held in care by the Shrine trustees on behalf of all Victorians, and we embrace the diversity of our state. And I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the families of the men and women on board the 2nd, 3rd Australian hospital ship Centaur that sank in 1943, and we thank you very much for joining us online today for our presentation. We also welcome all past and present members of the Australian Defence Forces and all the nurses who are with us, and on behalf of all gathered, I thank you for your service. As is customary before all programs at the Shrine, let us take a moment to honour the service and sacrifice of those who have died in the service of our nation. Are those in the auditorium who are able to stand, would you please do so? They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget. Okay, please be seated. March 8th marks International Women's Day, a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. The day also marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. 2021 is in fact the 4th year that the Shrine has held a special public program around International Women's Day. And this year we focus our attention on the service of nurses during the Second World War. And it is my really great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Madonna Grehan. Madonna is an independent historian, a registered general nurse and midwife, and honorary fellow in nursing at the University of Melbourne. She's an oral history interviewer for the National Library of Australia and an advisor to the television series Who Do You Think You Are? In 2012, with support from the Royal Australian College of Nursing, Madonna researched the 2nd, 3rd Australian hospital ship Centaur's complement of 12 Australian Army Nursing Service nurses, only one of whom survived the ship's sinking. In 2015, as the John Oxley Fellow at the State Library of Queensland, Madonna investigated the Centaur Memorial Fund for Nurses, Queensland's tribute to nurses who served the state during the 2 World Wars on the military and the home fronts. Madonna is also one of the co-curators of our current special exhibition, Dean Bowen's Imagining Centaur, with Shrine curator Neil Sharkey, and it's now on display in the gallery. So hopefully you'll get to have a look at that a bit later for those of you here with us in the auditorium. Please let's now welcome Dr. Madonna Grehan to the stage.
Thank you very much, Sue, and good morning, everybody. The theme of the International Women's Day this year is choosing to challenge, and I hope the idea of challenge comes through in my presentation today. We have Liftoff. When asked what the Second World War had done for nurses and nursing, a senior military nurse, some of you may know, Annie Sage, said that the war had taught nurses that they could achieve almost anything they set their minds to. This was no doubt true. This was not entirely due to the war itself. What it was possible for nurses to achieve in World War II was possible because of developments in society since World War I, because of what had come before, impelled by the emergency of a new war. It's also true that nurses and nursing's achievements collectively were possible because of the remarkable military and civilian nurses who had cleared the pathway for them, working in diverse roles. Within the nursing sphere, they were critical to the effective functioning of other nurses, those nurses who carried out bedside and other work. Understandably, when we think of war nursing, we think about bedside work, particularly about casualty clearing stations and hospitals. And while that was the bedrock of nurses' work, just as it is today, nursing in the Second World War was diverse. There were many roles which nurses undertook which were no less about nursing, but were not directly at the bedside. It's the same today. They're administrative, logistics, teaching, specialist roles away from the bedside. And as COVID-19 has shown us recently, a nurse's workplace can be a shopping centre car park for the collection of the all-important nasal and pharyngeal swabs. It can be an intensive care unit, a home, or a music festival these days. So in this brief discussion of nursing in the second AIF, my focus is on these other roles and the women who met the challenge that they were set. Most of the women I'm talking about were from Victoria, and they were in the Australian Army Nursing Service, or AANS as an acronym. Fundamentally, what they were doing may not seem like nursing, but they were nurses, and their work during the war was military nursing. Let me begin with a revision of nursing at the end of World War I. In 1918, nursing was still a relatively young profession. According to historian Dr. Kirsty Harris, the First World War had seen around 3,000 Australian nurses serve in a nursing or related capacity in the AIF or in other organisations. Some were bedside nurses, some were senior nurses, matrons, some were dietitians doing invalid cookery. Some were arranging special food for soldiers who had facial injuries and couldn't chew. Some were seamstresses, making the all-important padding to go with a splint. All were serving in a nursing capacity, yet sometimes we don't think of them as nurses. For most, the First World War was a hard war. Historians of World War I agree that modern artillery was responsible for the vast majority of injuries and deaths during this conflict. Munitions were so effective in maiming the human frame. Some of the injuries left men unrecognisable. Previously unprepared for this level of damage, a new field of medicine and nursing practice emerged as a result in the management of every sort of wound inflicted on service personnel. In the First World War, complex fractures that had killed people just 10 years earlier were dealt with by improved surgical management and immobilisation in the Thomas splint. Wounds were irrigated with solutions that were effective against bacteria, particularly gas gangrene, because infections were better understood, even though penicillin was still 20 years away. Nursing care was becoming increasingly prescribed and procedural before the First World War, but this conflict impelled the procedural nature of care to ensure a consistency of approach. Injuries such as mustard gas burns to lungs and other vulnerable mucous membranes, frostbite, shell shock had long-standing consequences. Reconstructive plastic surgery was one of the areas of specialisation where skin grafts were used to cover gaping holes made by burns or shrapnel. Increasingly specific sets of instruments and their use inevitably helped surgeons to work more effectively. In turn, responding to these sorts of injuries made the work of a theatre nurse increasingly specialised. That specialisation in World War I is reflected in the experience of nurse Kit McNaughton, whose World War I diary has been interpreted by historian Janet Butler as Kitty's War. Butler recognises McNaughton as a plastic surgery theatre nurse specialist, but she did not think of herself that way, and neither did her colleagues or the place she worked in. Post-World War I, there were other challenges for returning nurses. They arrived home to an epidemic of influenza which peaked in January 1919. It killed around 15,000 Australians, and its prevalence generated an increased regard for public health, just as COVID-19 is doing today. There was a focus on good sanitation, drainage, and controls over the sale of food and so on. And just as COVID-19 required, influenza required rapid responses. With nurses on the front line of influenza care, they are at serious risk of contracting the virus. Novel forms of personal protective equipment, PPE, some acronym we never thought we'd need to know, became a requisite part of nurses' accoutrements, despite the expense. Military nurses who were familiar with the new model of barrier nursing, which separated patients with infectious diseases from those who were healthy, applied their knowledge to civilian practice at home. The epidemic ultimately led to soul searching by the Commonwealth Government, conscious that the states operated their health systems independently of each other. In 1921, the federal government replaced what was the Quarantine Department with a new, far-reaching Federal Department of Health. Along with controlling quarantine, the Health Department aimed to identify weaknesses in people's vitality by using strategic demography and to methodologically manage health in areas of epidemiology, tuberculosis, and venereal disease, public health engineering, industrial hygiene, maternal and infant welfare, and tropical hygiene. Yet in 1921, nurses and nursing were not part of developing these plans or programs, although they were the deliverers of many of them. Nursing during World War I and in the 1920s was a respected occupation, but it was not particularly powerful or influential in policy terms. After all, compulsory registration for nurses and midwives did not apply in every state until 1925, when New South Wales finally passed legislation to control practice and practitioners. By the end of the Second World War, however, it was an entirely different story. Because it has to be said, medicine was not so dismissive of the strengths of the nursing profession and the immense contributions it made to human health. Medicine's relinquishing of just some control over the health sphere enabled nurses in World War II to shine, some of them in very senior roles. The career of Grace Wilson is emblematic of this gradual transition in nursing roles from World War I to between the wars to the Second World War. Wilson may be a very familiar figure to some of you. She was featured in the show Anzac Girls in the television series. She was born in Queensland and spent much of her life in Victoria. In 1915, she was appointed matron of 3 AGH, Australian General Hospital, which was planned for France. On the journey, the unit was redirected to Lemnos, where Wilson oversaw the care of 900 soldiers who'd been wounded at Gallipoli. Conditions for nurses were grim, with scant equipment and not enough warm clothing. Wilson's hospital, 3AGH, then moved to Egypt and later to France, where the hospital managed injuries and illnesses incurred on the Western Front. As historians of World War I have recorded, every location had its challenges. To a nurse who's non-military, it seems there is little routine about military nursing. Every aspect has its challenge. And the military nurse's response appears to be finding a way to manage them, whether they're logistical supply issues or people issues. Wilson's First World War experience was particularly long. She remained in London at the end of hostilities, working in the repatriation unit, which organised troops to return home. She was a general nurse and had studied midwifery in London. Her role in the repatriation unit included helping to arrange transport for men who had married and whose wives were pregnant. These ships carrying these passengers needed maternity facilities. It was Wilson's job to ensure the onboard facilities were sufficient to meet the task and to secure military nurses with midwifery qualifications to attend women in labour on the voyage. Wilson, with colleagues, also determined which soldiers needed a cot, the cot cases, ward-style beds rather than hammocks, or those who needed a cot because they were suffering mental illness. The logistics achieved by the repatriation unit alone are quite staggering, yet very little celebrated. And from establishing hospitals in inhospitable places, managing their staff to equipping ships, Wilson had a toolkit for the Second World War that we can only marvel at today. It's no surprise after World War I she was awarded a Royal Red Cross, a Commander of the British Empire and a Florence Nightingale Medal. Like many of her fellow military nurses, Wilson seemed to be energised by her war experience. After the First World War, she became active in nursing politics via Victoria's professional organisation, the Royal Victorian Trained Nurses Association, and its successor, the Royal Victorian College of Nursing. These organisations were focused on developing nursing's status as a profession. She owned and operated a private hospital, Somerset House, which is now part of St Vincent's. It was demolished. She was later appointed matron of the Alfred Hospital, then a large institution. She was passionate about nursing education and in 1930 conducted a self-funded world study tour of universities to investigate those institutions which offered nursing education as a degree qualification. Wilson was matron-in-chief of the Army Nursing Service Reserve for 15 years until 1939 when the role was made full-time. And with that, she resigned from her civilian job at the Alfred. She was 61 when she was called up to serve in the second AIF in 1940 and went to the Middle East. Ill health forced her retirement in 1941. With this immense personal experience and a pragmatist considering the vagaries of nursing politics, Wilson was the ideal appointment in 1943 when she was appointed Executive Officer of the Nursing Control Section of the Manpower Commission in Victoria. As historians Siobhan Nelson and Jennifer Rayback have reported, the inclusion of nurses like Wilson in seminal public service roles at a federal level was entirely new. Senior nurses were launched into the domain of planning and administration of the national workforce. For the first time, nurses were positioned to view the training, preparation and workforce needs of nursing nationally. It was the first time that government recognised that nursing was critical to national security and made it subject to the manpower regulations which controlled the exchange of personnel across the nation. It was also the first time that the Commonwealth Government attempted, and I have to say failed spectacularly, to quantify the supply of registered nurses and midwives in Australia. Grace Wilson, through her career experience from World War I through between the wars, arrived at the Second World War and nursed in the AIF in a senior role administratively, managing logistics, managing enormous numbers of people. And yet we don't think about these women as nurses sometimes. We tend to think of them as administrators because they're not by the bedside. But Wilson was one of those women who managed to break that glass ceiling and raised nursing's prominence in the public domain. Her successor was, as matron-in-chief in 1940, was Janet Sinclair Wood from South Australia. According to the British Journal of Nursing, the task of matron-in-chief was to supervise the entire nursing organisation of the Army at home and abroad. When Sinclair Woods retired, her successor in January 1943 was another remarkable military nurse, Annie Sage. Sage was Matron-in-Chief of the Australian Army Nursing Service for 9 years. She was a fine administrator and pragmatic leader. As Perdita McCarthy has recorded, the Matron-in-Chief role required enormous organisational and administrative abilities. Sage came from the small community of Somerville on the Mornington Peninsula. She was a renowned horsewoman, and as you can see in this slide, she loved sport. And there's the ball in Fawkner Park. And as I read it, she had a very well-adjusted sense of humour. She was the granddaughter of Melbourne surveyor Robert Hoddle. In July 1924, Sage completed a combined training in general and midwifery nursing at the Melbourne and Women's Hospitals. She also studied public health and was awarded the diploma in public health by the Royal Sanitary Institute in London. The London course had been launched in 1910 and did attract many nurses, but we're not quite sure in Australia just how many. In Melbourne, it was conducted by an authorised branch of the Institute. Certificate holders could work as sanitary inspectors, school nurses, public health visitors, and especially in infant welfare. Sage also earned her certificate in infant welfare from Tweddle Baby Hospital in Melbourne in February 1931. She stayed working in infant welfare, really in a public health, health promotion role at the Carlton Training School of the Victorian Baby Health Care Centres. Then she taught, was matron at the Mothercraft Centre at Balwyn, eventually returned to Carlton as matron of that training school. And during these years, Sage had a weekly spot on ABC Radio 3LO called Baby, and sometimes His Majesty Baby, I think that's correct. With more than a decade of senior administrative experience combined with effective communication skills honed in teaching and radio, Sage was an able leader in nursing. In 1940, within weeks of signing up to the Australian Army Nursing Service, she was appointed to the Second Australian General Hospital. After 2 years in the Middle East, where she established a field hospital, she returned to Australia to an appointment as Deputy Matron-in-Chief at Land Headquarters in Melbourne. Her next appointment in early 1943 was as Matron-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces, When nurses were afforded official rank in March 1943, Sage became Colonel. Throughout her military career, like other senior nurses, in some areas she commanded men. And this created a problem for Sage when she returned to civilian life after the war at the Royal Women's Hospital, where non-military men did not like the assertiveness of a past military matron. During her command, Sage visited every location where nurses were serving. Her connection with nurses on the ground generated a level of loyalty as Grace Wilson enjoyed. Both women were nurses fundamentally. They wanted to understand what their nurses were doing, how they were faring, and what their needs were. Their roles were a special kind of nursing, a nursing leadership that unified. When Sage flew to Sumatra in 1945 to repatriate the released prisoners of war nurses, those nurses did not know her and asked, "Who are you?" Sage answered, "I am the mother of you all, Matron-in-Chief, Anne Sage." She also brought them lipstick to wear for their journey to Singapore. Author Jan Bassett quoted one of the ex-POWs at the time, Sister Clancy, who cried, "What on earth has happened to everything? Fancy, sisters in pants." And of course, things had changed substantially in nursing practice and nursing uniform, in nursing organisation in the 3 years that the nurses had been on Sumatra, closed off from the world. Sage described the meeting with her POW nurses as the most moving experience of her life. This was nursing, just not by the literal bedside as we imagine it. Next, I want to move to some other examples of World War II nursing which are reflected in the current exhibition on show at the Shrine of Remembrance. These are some of the nurses who served aboard sea ambulance transports and hospital ships, because until aircraft evacuations were possible, sea transport was the only way to return injured personnel to Australia. This is the one Netherlands military hospital ship, Oranje, or as we tend to say in Australia, Orange. So I think I'll call it Oranje. Nursing at sea, again, was a different sort of nursing in the second AIF. Hospital ships had been used in World War I, but by 1940, requisition ships were liners, like this one, newly built, with accommodation for 650 soldiers. They had extensive facilities, operating theatres, and gymnasia with rehabilitation facilities. This one even had a pool. It was one of the largest, the Oranje, a gift of the Dutch government to the Australian and New Zealand governments to repatriate injured troops. The ship was initially staffed with Dutch nurses, doctors and orderlies. A select group of Australian and New Zealand medical personnel was appointed to assist with overall management of the Anzacs. These are some promotional photographs that were taken the day that Mr. Menzies arrived to take over the Oranje in Sydney. And on the right-hand side, you can see, I'll compare you, just keep this in your mind. There's 3 people standing there. This is an operating theatre with anaesthetic equipment. And these are 3 of the senior Dutch nurses. The group that assisted the Dutch staff of the Oranje was the Liaison staff. One of them was a nurse from Cowell in South Australia, which is on the eastern side of the Eyre Peninsula. Her name was Mary Hamilton McFarland. Mary was in London in 1939 on tour with her brigadier uncle when the war broke out. She was desperate to serve and tried to sign up in London, but was too young. So she returned home with her uncle, and they were followed by a German U-boat on the way. Desperate to serve, she spent 1940 doing her midwifery training, and she joined the AANS in 1941 as soon as she turned 25, which was the age for entry at that time. Within 6 months of being a military nurse, Mary was appointed to the unique role of Australian liaison nursing sister aboard Oranje. Mary, it has to be said, was the right fit for this particular nursing job in the second AIF. She was qualified, intelligent, enthusiastic, and she could speak French fluently, which of course was important when you're working with European European personnel who didn't necessarily speak English. Many of the Dutch spoke French. On top of that, she was from a military family, with her uncle a brigadier and her father a World War I veteran. Happily for the press coverage of the new ship when Menzies welcomed it into the Australian fold in 1941, Mary was very photogenic, and she featured in a promotional film about the Oranje, which is viewable on the British Pathé website. I can let you know what the address is. Among the staff Mary and her colleagues nursed was Sir Roden Cutler, later Governor-General of Australia. He'd had an amputation after a wound that became gangrenous in the Middle East. You can see in this picture, Mary is down the back. Most of these are from her own scrapbook, which she labelled. Most of her photographs are labelled, thankfully. And this is the officers' ward, where everyone is doing their own morning bath. And there's a lot more room in this ward than there is on the wards for the non-commissioned officers and soldiers. Other people Mary and her colleagues looked after were like George Quantock. As Rod Quantock, the comedian who some of you may know, said, cranky Uncle George, as he was known, because Uncle George came from the country and was a very keen horseman, and his foot was amputated. Most of his leg, actually below the knee, was amputated. So no wonder he was cranky Uncle George on the way home on the Oronia. And it was up to Mary and her colleagues to help these soldiers transition from what was an exciting war into a life as an amputee. When the Dutch staff were recalled to the Netherlands, Australian and New Zealand nurses, doctors and orderlies were recruited in their place. Mary McFarland was joined by nurses from all over Australia, most of whom had been working in Victoria and New South Wales. The new matron of the Oronia was Anne Jewell, a Western Australian who began nursing at the age of 23 after working as a secretary. After a short career in Western Australia, Jewell moved to Melbourne around 1929, taking a job at the H.B. Mackay Massey Harris factory, also known as the Sunshine Harvester Works, where she was in charge of welfare work and accident cases. She was the first aid sister. She also had wonderful relationships with the workforce who held her in high esteem and worked there for 7 years. She had a lot to do with their wives because she had lots of migrants with young families. She judged baby shows and had all kinds of communication skills that we don't associate with nursing, yet they all contributed to the person who came to the second AIF. In 1937, she took on a highly technical position with a leading Collins Street specialist, Dr. Frank May, who she knew from Perth. May was an early rehabilitation doctor. He was an enthusiastic advocate of physical therapy for muscular conditions, using ultra-shortwave diathermy to apply heat to injured limbs. For 4.5 years, Jewell worked at Epworth Hospital in May's private practice, working with injured, lots of men, in fact, from factories. So the combination of industrial accident work and rehabilitation therapy equipped her well with the skills suited to recovery from injury and general ill health in soldiers. In December 1940, she joined the Australian Army Nursing Service and for almost a year served with the ambulance sea transports aboard troop ships, ferrying soldiers to conflict zones. And on some of these ships, sick Nazi prisoners of war were returned to Australia. In March 1942, she joined the Oronia, and by all accounts was a firm disciplinarian and a generous human being. According to Colonel Annie Sage, Jewell was one of the most efficient nurses in the service and possessing a charming personality. When you think about managing 650 injured soldiers and probably at least 50 staff of all kinds, merchant seamen on the ship, you need all of those skills to allow all of the people below you who are doing the nursing at the bedside to function well. But the Oronia was a large liner and it made slow journeys. On the way to the Middle East, nurses ready themselves for the long shifts on the journey home that they would be working. Now let me just show you. We're lucky to have Kathleen Carew, who married a soldier and became Mrs. Gardner. She was a very keen photographer, and some of the photographs of second AIF nursing on hospital ships is because Kath took photographs and her family donated them to the War Memorial. During 1942, conflict in the Pacific escalated, and with much of the fighting in New Guinea, there was need for a smaller vessel which could navigate little harbours and inlets and retrieve soldiers more speedily. Anne, Jewell, Mary McFarland and 5 other nurses from the Oronia were selected to serve on the new hospital ship, the 2nd, 3rd Australian hospital ship, Centaur. Nurses in the 2nd AIF were formally awarded ranks in March 1943. Jewell became a major, McFarland a captain. The other 10 nurses were lieutenants. Before that, they'd had honorary rank, but getting the rank was critical to recognition from their soldiers who were beneath them in rank. Like the Oronia, the Centaur had to be refitted with an operating theatre, dentist surgery, x-ray room, rehabilitation room, and of course, cots stacked in twos. It had to be supplied with medical equipment, drugs, linen, and so on. And of course, the people who were involved in doing this were the nurses who were to serve aboard the ship, and Jewell and Mary McFarland. So while they weren't in the jungles, while they weren't in casualty clearing stations, they were doing nursing so that their colleague nurses would be able to come and serve on board the minute the ship left the dock. Once installed, the Centaur was taken for short runs from Williamstown to test if the medical equipment, such as trolleys, locked in place during a swell. This oversight and testing work was critical to good performance in the Pacific Ocean. It was nursing planning and logistics, preparing the way for others to ease into the hard yards of hospital ship practice. And nursing aboard the Centaur was not for the faint-hearted. I said before, make sure you look at that picture of the operating room. And there were 3 nurses in it with quite a bit of equipment around them and quite a bit of room. This one is quite different. You could barely pass each other, let alone provide an anaesthetic in such a tiny place. The ship had a shallow, as I said, it wasn't for the faint-hearted because the ship had a shallow draft, which enabled it to navigate the shallow waters around New Guinea. But of course, that meant that at sea, the ship rolled. So if you were liable to seasickness, you were no good to perform on this particular ship. So, and for any nurses or cooks in the room, just think of handing over a scalpel or a knife to the surgeon during one of the Queensland's notorious summer storms, or doing a dressing on an injured leg while the ship was in motion. The Centaur had at least 2 highly experienced theatre nurses on board, one of whom was new to the AANS. Eileen Rutherford, you saw before knitting, I think, on the Oronia, was formerly deputy matron and head sister at Windermere Private Hospital here in Melbourne, in Windsor. The other was Ali O'Donnell, a skilled nurse from Myrtleford, who was a private nurse to Sir Alan Newton, a specialist in thyroid surgery. He operated at the Melbourne Hospital and then travelled to Western Victoria every couple of months to perform surgery at Terang and Camperdown. I have to say, Ali O'Donnell must have been a real trooper because on those trips to Camperdown and Terang, Sir Alan Newton took his wife and Ali O'Donnell had to cook for all of them. As many of us did and will remember cooking on night duty for our colleagues. 3 of the other nurses from the Oronia on the Centaur had already had a year of hospital ship nursing aboard Oronia. Now, I'm sorry that Neil Sharkey isn't able to be with us today. Neil's the curator of the exhibition, Dean Bowen's Imagining Centaur, because I was hoping to show him this early on. I think this is the only photograph of the Centaur's 12 nurses. It comes from Mary McFarland's home scrapbook, and it's was stuck into the book, so I couldn't rip it off and look at the back because Mary did label every photograph. Her family are considering taking it out of the album. All of the nurses pictured on this ship nursing, bar 1, lost their lives when the hospital ship Centaur sank, was torpedoed by enemy fire and then sank. Ellen Savage, hiding up the back, because she was a very shy individual. Her medals, including her George Medal, are on display in the Shrines exhibition, seen in public for the first time thanks to her family who hold them in Canberra. So for people like Grace Wilson, for Annie Sage, Janet Sinclair Wood and all other senior nurses, the loss of nurses in the second AIF was a profound loss for the profession, not just the military profession, but the profession generally. When you add up all of the years that this group has served to nursing, it's 160. They were extremely skilled individuals, one of a kind, you could say. And of course, there were numerous nurses killed in Egypt. Glad Thomas, who was from the Alfred, killed in an accident with a colleague. Margaret de Mestre is killed in the bombing of the Manunda, and her colleague Lorraine Blow was very severely injured. Then there were the POWs in Sumatra, in Yokohama, and others who died from injury in tropical disease. My colleague, Dr. Kirsty Harris, is working on an improved nominal roll of the Australian nurses who served during World War II. Kirsty's latest report is that 3,536 Australian Army Nursing Service nurses served, 636 in the Royal Australian RAAF Nursing Service, I beg your pardon, and 74 in the Royal Australian Navy Nursing Service in the Second World War, while 400 or so she's found so far served under other nations. The 11 Centaur nurses were among a total of 78 who died on active service with the second AIF. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned Grace Wilson, Matron-in-Chief and former matron of the Alfred Hospital. In 1953, the Alfred Hospital's Past Nurses Association commissioned memorial gates for the nurses' home. And Eileen Rutherford's family and friends gave a sundial to the hospital, which is currently in the basement of the hospital in storage. Prue's nodding. She assures me it's there. I have seen it. They were specially to the memory of Eileen Rutherford, the young woman I showed you knitting there on the deck of the Aronia on the way to Port Tewfik in Suez. She was killed on the Centaur, and the memorial gates and the sundial were a memorial to all of the nurses who had served at the hospital and served with the AANS. Grace Wilson had known many of the nurses killed in the service of the AIF, second AIF. Some of them were her students at the Alfred. In her address, she remarked on the purpose of these memorials, saying, and I quote, "We do not mean to glorify war. The nursing profession would be the last one to do this. Our knowledge of the destructive side of war is too intimate. Our work is to help heal physically and mentally those who must inevitably be hurt by it. These members did that to the best of their ability and died while doing it. Their people may wonder why they died when they were so youthful and so young. It may help them to feel it worthwhile if it makes the rest of us think a little more." In conclusion, let me tell you a little personal story. When I began my training in Queensland in 1978, it was only a little more than 30 years since the end of World War II. Our dad had served in New Guinea, had malaria, been shot twice. He was treated at casualty clearing stations, field hospitals, orthopaedic hospitals, and convalescent homes, all run by nurses like the ones I've shown you today. Yet I knew nothing growing up of their endeavours, their aspirations, their passion, and their commitment that both military and civilian nurses had for their profession and for the people in their care. I knew nothing of their nursing because I thought nursing was only about the bedside. Since I've become a historian, I've had cause to acquaint myself with a little of the context of war nursing, as you've heard. And I've only touched lightly the surface of nursing, given it's such a lengthy history. And I've concentrated on the AANS, not the RANs or the RAFNs but I do now, as Grace Wilson asked the assembled crowd to do so at the Alfred in 1953. I think a little more of all of these women who rose to the incredible challenges that everyday nursing in the second AIF set for them. Remembering their contributions by thinking of them more, as Grace Wilson said, I do not mean to glorify war, but I am in total awe of them. I think of them as the thousands of nurses in the Army, Navy and Air Force who attended soldiers like my dad, whether they were in logistics or at the bedside, whether they were seamstresses or invalid cooks. I think of the thousands of people these remarkable 4,500 nurses cared for during their service careers, the hope and the immense comfort they provided as nurses, whatever their roles were. As historians Nelson and Rayback saw it, World War II opened doors for Australian nurses, and as Anne Sage said, they could do anything they set their minds to. As I see it, the nurses of the second AIF embraced every challenge and did their best, no matter the cost. Theirs was a magnificent, untiring service. Lest we forget. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Madonna. That was absolutely fantastic. So we have some time for questions. I'm sure with that wealth of material, there must be one or two questions out there. Madonna would be very happy to answer those for you.
Yes.
Is there any service going on at the moment for the memorial to the centre? I know the Preston AIF used to run one at Heidelberg.
Yes.
Hospital, but,
May I ask your name? That's where I recognise you from.
Bruce James is my name.
Yes, I think I've met you out at Heidelberg. There has been a memorial service at Heidelberg on the Sunday closest to the 14th of May, the day of the sinking of the Centaur, probably since the Second World War. In Queensland, there's one on the 14th of May every year, and Concord Hospital in Sydney has had one on the 14th of May every year too. But both Heidelberg and Concord have ceased. I think it's a great shame because there's still relatives, nephews and nieces of people on board the Centaur, and in fact daughters. Jan Thomas of the 2nd, 3rd Centaur Association, her father was killed on the Centaur, Bernie Hindmarsh. And there is it's a small community, but one that still wants to express grief and sadness at the waste of war. As Neil Sharkey, the curator, said during our discussion about the exhibition, war is the crime. We talk about war crimes, but really war is the crime. It remains that way. But I still think it's important for people to be able to meet and remember people who were related or served their profession, whether it was the 12th Ambulance or the merchant seamen or the doctors or the nurses. And one of the critiques we have, certainly in Queensland, and I can say this as a Queenslander because I attend the Centaur service, is that people complain that we focus too much on the nurses. And that's unfortunate because really the nursing profession is the last thing left as a unit out of that war. There's lots and lots of memorials around Australia. I didn't have time to list them today, but there were all sorts of nursing school prizes. There are memorial gates on parks. There are tablets at hospitals. St Catherine's, the librarian, West Helen, has a tablet in the clock tower to remember Jenny Walker, who was killed on the Centaur. They're all over the place. And yet, when people don't have a gathering point, it does seem that we only talk about the nurses. When on the Centaur, 251 other people were killed on the Centaur, not just 11 nurses. But it's, as I see it, it's the nursing profession's responsibility to carry the torch carry a flame for everybody who has made a sacrifice in serving the nation, and they still do. So I can't tell you that there's a service this year, but it might be worthwhile asking Darab and RSL, because they're the ones who supply the afters when we've all left the service at Heidelberg. Perhaps we'll have a chat afterwards. One thing I wanted to say today was about, I think people when we talk about nursing, they expect it to be about the bedside, and yet the bedside can't work. We now know this from COVID-19, without arrangements, without administrative structure, without rules, and someone has to set them and someone has to organise them. And in terms of hospital management, some of those roles have been taken away from nurses these days. I know quite a few nurses in the audience who I think probably would like that they weren't taken away. But in fact, in the second AIF, nursing was really in control of hospital care. Sure, with medicine, but nurses, it's all right, I've hit the screen. Nurses were much more in control of how hospitals functioned, how nurses were trained, and I think it was a sort of not exactly a peak, but it was a powerful episode in the history of nursing in Australia where there were lots of possibilities and doors opened, and women who saw challenges could meet them. People like Grace Wilson and Anne Sage, they trained all of the ones who came after them, who then continued that tradition within our hospital system. And it's something I think that we've lost. Jane Bell, one of the early matrons who was in World War I, she wrote an appeal in 1939 to the nurses who were going to the war not to deplete the whole supply in Australia. She wanted people to go, but she also didn't want nursing to lose the role of being a dietitian and doing invalid cookery, which of course nursing has lost. Didn't want nursing to lose the physical therapy role, which it has lost to physiotherapy, and so on. So they had a lot of foresight, these women, and I think they're quite remarkable because they enabled other people to do the work that I really didn't have time to talk about today. I know there's quite a few people in the audience who were hoping I'd talk about India and Colombo and Malaysia, but when you think about it, that history is so rich. It's really time for someone to take it on board after Jan Bassett did such a fantastic job in her book Guns and Brooches. Yes, Lee Gilbert from the Shrine.
You mentioned that about halfway through the war, the nurses were given military ranks and held honorary ranks. Before that, was that something that the nurses were fighting for, and did it really affect how they operated or how they were treated?
I have to say, it's an episode I'm interested in, and I couldn't say I'm an authority on. Someone else might like to comment.
I missed that.
Oh, the question was about the awarding of ranks officially in 1943. To me, I think it's critical because suddenly they were allowed to say lieutenant. Before, it was a bit ladylike. They were given an honorary ranking without being ranked. So once there was a rank in the Army, Navy or Air Force, you had to respect it. So if I'm a captain and you're a corporal, as far as I can tell, I'm in charge. But, this is 1943 and men did not take lightly to being directed by women. It's a fact. Some men embraced it. Some men realised that women like Grace Wilson and Sage, they were incredible people. Their brain, I'm honestly astounded at the capacity for organisation because it's astounding. But, I think it was really critical. I think it's an important point. I don't know, Jan, what would you like to say something about that?
I think it's,
Jan McCarthy, for people who don't know, Jan, retired colonel.
Been in the military, it is very important because you're dealing with a lot of other ranks, of various ranks, and to get the job done at times, you certainly do need the rank. It's not that you're being aggressive or anything like that, but they appreciate the rank, and they really do, and particularly in nursing. I found, that on the whole, I served in Vietnam, and I was saying the other day, in my entire service in Vietnam, I was in theatre, I never heard my theatre technicians, which I was the only theatre sister, be nasty or aggressive or even swear in front of me. And, because of the rank, they appreciated it, and they didn't look on you as being an aggressive person with the rank, but you were there to do the job and help them.
And it wasn't because you were a woman they wouldn't swear in front of you. It was because you were a senior rank, because they wouldn't swear in front of a man who was a senior officer. So,
Otherwise they'd be in trouble.
yeah. So yes, somehow to me, I find it really important, and the fact that it happened just 2 months before the Centaur sank is really poignant somehow. Thank you.
Could I just say, looking back on the First World War, the matron-in-chief of the, certainly in England, held the rank of a major, and she was not paid the rank of the major. You didn't get the money for the rank, and not until 1978 when we got equal pay. In fact, I always felt that 1 in 5 years I worked for nothing. That was interesting.
And so that means, Jan, in World War I, Edith Conyers wasn't paid.
No.
Yeah. And a lot of the women from World War I must say, from World War II, it's a little bit different, but World War I, so many of those women became unwell because they were serving for so long. And if they got sick the moment they got off the ship, they weren't entitled to repatriation, to a pension, effectively. Mark Doherty in Queensland is doing quite a big study on the Queensland nurses and repatriation. It's very telling who was allowed to have the Commonwealth money and who wasn't. Anyway, it's 1 o'clock. We must finish, I think.
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Madonna for her time and her expertise. A really fascinating topic, and I think quite thought-provoking, certainly for myself and hopefully for you too. Thank you for your attendance today, both here and online. Your continued support enables us to keep providing these types of programs and events. For those that are interested, our next program will be the Autumn Gardens Tour on the 27th of March. I'm very excited that we can have real people at real programs at the Shrine. It's terrific. Spaces are limited for that one, so if you are interested in that, please make sure to book in. You can check our website for details. And if you haven't had the chance again, I think Madonna and I both plugged this pretty good today. The Dean Bowen Imagining Centaur exhibition, it's on display now, and I'd encourage you, if you've got the chance, to have a look at that today before you depart. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you again soon at the Shrine. Thank you.